In this interview with John Scanlon, you will hear him share the following story. I remember meeting someone not long ago who had been adopted. They never thought it was an issue because they were adopted at birth. However, they kept experiencing certain traumas in their life, patterns that kept repeating themselves. When they finally recognized this repeating cycle, they discovered that their birth mother had experienced the exact same cycle. And that became the process they had to work through. Everyone processes these experiences differently, but at the core of it all, it comes down to the need to feel loved and wanted. So when you work with people, you meet each person in their own way, helping them feel empowered. It's a process that allows people to truly feel good enough in themselves, because often those who have been adopted struggle with feeling good enough. Welcome to my podcast, From Thoughts to Transformation. Today I have a guest with me, and it's all the way from Ireland. Do I pronounce it right, John? Ireland?
Yeah, it's a unique place. You can say it whichever way suits, but yeah,
Great.
Ireland, yeah.
Ireland. I have John Scanlon with me, and he's a hypnotherapist like me. But today I'm addressing a topic that is about adoption. And I know you know a lot about that. Isn't that
Yes,
right?
that is correct.
Yeah.
That is correct. I mean, I am adopted myself, so I work a lot with it, and I train hypnotherapists in it as well. It's something that has been, I suppose, always been important to me. Having lived that life, if you like, lived the life of an adopted person. And it's not that it's, I suppose the best way to describe it, adoption is something that just happens, but life happens on top of that. But it gives, for the majority of adopted people, there's a set of core beliefs that come with it. And they may not, they're not obvious when someone's a child, because obviously a child can't articulate, but there is emotional memory. And when those, I suppose, core beliefs manifest later on in adult life in certain types of behaviors, that's when they become that issue. That people, and actually they become an issue because people are feeling and living those experiences all their lives, whether it's feeling of excluded, feeling of not being good enough, the feeling of being rejected when they were a child, and that then manifests in certain behaviors as people go on, whether it's a fear of authority, whether it's a fear of being rejected. So people tend to leave stuff earlier so they won't be hurt again. And there's a number of different ways in which that manifests, but it's not just the child, because there's also the birth parents. And I mean, that even that in itself is a complicated scenario. And then there's also the adopting parents. So it's a whole triad that affects people in many different ways. And so it's something that I've both lived and worked. And so I kind of have developed a passion for that particular topic.
Yeah. And what about the siblings?
Yeah, there is a difference, and say, for instance, in my own case, I was adopted. My parents had been trying for years to have a child. And 2 years later, they had a naturally born child, who's a brother who I'm very close to and I love dearly. Emotionally, that probably caused, some confusion, not necessarily for him because I was already there, but for me, yeah. So, and it likewise it can be in reverse, where if an adopted child is brought into the family afterwards, for whatever reason that may be,
Yeah.
it changes the dynamic. It just changes the dynamic, and there is
Yeah.
something different about it. Um, so yeah, I mean, I suppose the thing about adoption is that if it depends on the angle in which you're looking at it from. If you're looking at it from the angle of the child, there is a there's a set of emotions that come with that, and then it's the environment in which they go into which determines what happens next. But those basic conditions still exist, um, because if you take the definition of adoption, for want of a better term, the legal definition just basically says it's the action of legally taking another person's child and bringing it up as your own. You know,
Mm.
so that child has spent 9 months getting used, being developed in a womb. It's familiar with that energy. It knows that mother's energy. Um, Science is beginning to look at things where there is actually physical, you know, parts. There's connections between, and I think every mother would probably testify to the fact that they could sense if there's something going on with their child, even if they're many, many miles away. And then so that child is now suddenly not with that energy anymore, not with that person that they've been growing up with. And it's like, just because they can't speak doesn't mean they can't feel, because as hypnotherapists, we know um, that we have emotional memory, and we have emotional memory from way back when.
Mm.
And also, I mean, there are studies that go to show the effect of the impact of the process on the mother, and how it then affects the child later on in life, whether they're sicker, whether they're more likely to be involved in addiction, or whatever the case may be.
Is that normal
In which way?
to get addicted?
It's more prone. I'm not saying it's normal. It's more likely, though.
Okay.
It's about twice the population average.
Mm.
In terms of adoption, now, there could be other circumstances at play there as well.
Yeah.
And like I suppose the thing about adoption is that it is very unique and different for each and every person within that,
Yeah.
and subsequently what happens to them. Because I'll say a lot of children growing up in Ireland in the 60s, 70s, 80s, who were adopted would have spent time in an orphanage. Therefore, they're not receiving that love and care that they necessarily get in a home environment where, they cry, somebody picks them up, they get the attention. That
Mm.
neural pathways develop in that space. Uh,
Mm.
and that doesn't necessarily come along with being raised in an orphanage or something like that. The same would apply actually, for children who would be fostered quite young as well. So you are talking about similar types. With adoption, it's from the very beginning though. So therefore, it's really at the inception stage. And what it does is, in my opinion, it sets a direction. And there are certain tendencies which adopted people tend to develop. But it's not just about the child, because it's also the parents. I mean, I've come across, everybody will be familiar with the birth mother, and the birth mother may have her own unique reason for having the child adopted. In some
Mm.
cases, it's a lifestyle choice. In some cases that is the case. Um, in my own case, and in many people's cases, it's family circumstances and societal circumstances that dictate that.
Yeah.
Um, And then there's the effect of shame and guilt that mother is carrying all the way through her life, and how it affects her. Um, and also the relationship with the father, how that has affected that, because,
Mm.
that there could be rejection even within that relationship, which has never been dealt with. The other side of it is that the father may not even know. And I've come across cases where, adopted children are looking for their father, who has no idea they have a child. And then there's, how do you process that when a child suddenly sends a message to your door?
Yeah.
You know, and then there's the parents who are adopting, because often they've been trying for children for a long time. They're quite nervous when the child comes. Um, and it's how they process that. It's how they build that in. It's different because they haven't been visibly pregnant for 9 months beforehand. Suddenly a child is there one day,
Yeah.
and sometimes causes issues as well for individuals. So there's a lot goes on in the adoption process, basically,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know. But ultimately, Tina, it's a bit, I suppose, it's life happens on top of adoption. There's still the same stuff that people go through. They still have to go to school. They still have to live with parents who have their own issues and kind of impart them to their children, as all of us have done down through the centuries and millennium. And we'll continue to do as much as we become more educated and learn and learn and learn. We're human. We're still going to be that way. Hopefully, we just get better and better at it as it goes.
In your own life, you were adopted
Yes.
and you went to a foster home.
I spent the first 7 months of my life in an orphanage, and then I was adopted.
Okay. And did you stay at the same family or?
Yeah, well, the orphanage was just one large building.
Okay.
It's where mothers went and they had the child, and often they stayed there themselves. They worked in that place for a little while, etc. Ireland has a fairly checkered history with that stuff, unfortunately,
Okay.
of tribunals and investigations into the behavior at the time. Um, you know,
Mm.
because well, that's a really long rabbit hole to go down, to be honest. But I suppose it, people weren't always treated properly, and there was a
Okay.
huge secrecy about it.
Mm.
And
Okay.
that's probably our Catholic guilt and shame stuff that has just stayed with us down through
Yeah.
centuries.
Okay.
I mean, if you think about that, when you actually take the concept of adoption and you take the emotional side of it out,
Yeah.
then there is a logic to it. There's a pure logic to it that a mother feels she can't raise a child, so she gives that child to someone else. That
Mm.
gives the child, in theory, the best opportunity and the best chance. And from a logical perspective, that actually makes sense. But once
Yeah.
we understand that the child has emotions, the mother has emotions, uh, the father potentially has an involvement in this and maybe had no say in it actually and wanted the child to stay. So that's the other factor. Um, and there we don't know because every set of circumstances is different. But when you consider that the child has emotional memory and everybody involved in that has emotional memory and they're not properly dealt with, then that's where the issues become.
Yeah.
Because as you'll be very familiar, when logic and emotion have an argument, emotion will always win. And many of the therapies that are used are talk therapies. They go to the logical side. The issue is that the issue of adoption, the issues around early childhood trauma are not logical.
Mm.
So it really is to access the emotional mind to allow those changes to happen. And that's basically the approach that I take as I go through that is accessing the emotional mind. And by far the best and easiest therapy is hypnotherapy for that.
Yeah.
And the reason is, I mean, I've lived this all my life. I've lived that feeling of being excluded, of rejected, of not feeling good enough. Um, and and many hypnotherapists will. It's not just me, or many adopted people will, I should say. And often people don't feel good enough because of life experiences anyway. You don't have to be adopted to feel that. It is probably a common thing that feeds through the adoption process. Um, so I didn't want to live half the experiences that I lived. Um, so do I really want my clients to have to do the same thing? No, not if I can do it better. Not if I can show them how to do it quickly and easier.
No, of course not.
You know,
No, because you have the experience about the
yes,
feelings behind. this topic can be very emotional, and you have your story,
Yes.
and you meet a lot of clients who has their background and their story. Um, have you ever tried to, when you have a client, to, we talk about this when we are therapists, that we don't have, we don't, it's not good for us to step over in their shoes. But when it's a topic which is very near to you and you have this experience, how do you do when it happens, if it happens?
Well, it does happen. And it's part of who I am. It's part of my approach. It's part of because I'm comfortable within myself. And I've pretty much gone through, I'm not saying that there isn't always something that might potentially just pop back up at some point in time. However, um, it's when I say it's part of my approach, it helps people to build rapport. It helps people to know that I understand.
Mm,
Um, it helps people to know that I've been in that position and that I know how to deal with this. Because ultimately, as a hypnotherapist, what we are ultimately trying to do, and it's somebody gave me the beautiful definition of it recently, which was um, to help people to find happiness by changing their mind. And and I thought that's an absolutely beautiful, whatever way happiness is for them, it could be the release of something, the replacement with something else. But what it is about is that when I engage with them, they get to understand that I understand. So
yeah.
therefore, now, as you will be aware, a lot of what I do is a content-free type environment anyway. So I don't necessarily need to know a lot of the individual stuff that they're carrying. Um, if they want to talk about it, that's absolutely fine. I don't have a problem. And if it can't be cleared in a content-free way, um, then yes, there's other techniques to allow that process to release the emotion around it because we can't change what happened. But what we can do is change, we can help people to look at what it means for them and how they can look at it differently. And to do
Mm,
it from that emotional level where that change is actually real and permanent, not just a conceptual thought that they have in their logical brain, that when the other thought kicks off again, the emotion will always win. No, what we're trying to do and what we are doing is taking the emotion out of it.
yeah.
Uh, and my approach is it's the pre-talk that basically, um, you know, it's the part in advance of the therapy. That's where so much of the work, the allowing people to be comfortable, to know that I know what I'm talking about, to know that I have the tools, and to know that it's not as difficult to process as they might actually believe.
Mm,
Because we've been led to believe that therapy is difficult and painful. But for everything before today is over,
yeah.
you have survived each and every one. You are perfectly fine. Your logical brain goes, I know that. Why is he telling me that? Your emotional brain doesn't.
No, correct. Yeah.
And it is about allowing, giving people the freedom to express what they need to express in the way that they need to express it.
Mm,
Um, and to allow that change then to take place to figure out what it is that they want in its place. Um, and that's a normal standard therapy approach. With the adoption process, it tends to be that you're revisiting a lot of life experiences from a different perceptual place.
yeah. And maybe you live in a family, your new family, and they don't think like you, they don't look like you, because it's not always, an adoption is not always in the same country. Sometimes people adopt
Yeah,
children from other countries.
absolutely.
So that there can be the color of your skin
Color of your skin is different.
different.
So, and those
But
children are dealing with something else. They're dealing with Um, they're dealing with standing out in a little way,
Yeah.
in a different way. And as society, as human beings, we don't like to stand out. You know, we like to be part of a group. We're always seeking, um,
Yeah.
community. Sometimes the color of our skin is one of the, particularly if you live in a culture where it's different. Like, I suppose in Ireland, it's really only in the last 15, 20 years that we've opened up our borders and there's so many more different nationalities that live here now. But
Mm.
up until that time, it was extremely rare. There was people of different nationalities that live in Ireland. It was very Irish, literally. But I think nearly 10% of our population is now Polish, you know, um,
Yeah.
and it's only expanding. So with other nationalities and other cultures, and as the world gets smaller as well. So that is also a factor, and that's also helping people. That's part of the process for people, particularly when it's international adoptions.
Sometimes you get adopted and you know it. You know it from the start. But sometimes everybody around you have kept it a secret for you, and you just find out about it when you are grown up. So have you any experience about um, the difference about that?
And Tina, what I would say to you is yes, is the answer, but everybody processes stuff like that differently. Everybody processes. I mean, for instance, I and most adopted people would be informed from an early stage that they are adopted.
Mm,
What is the significance of that? You're different. Does that make sense? Now, that's a really simple statement. You're different,
yeah,
but you're different. Do you
yeah.
understand?
So it doesn't matter the story behind. You just know you're
You
different.
just know you're different.
Yeah, yeah.
And as human beings, do we really want to be different? And then there are those who find out much later on in life. And if you actually think about that from a purely conceptual point from the mind, when their habits, behaviors, and beliefs have been formed up to about the age 7, roughly, as far as we know,
Mm,
um, they've grown up normal. They've grown up with those normal set of beliefs. However, there's a depending on the adoption process and the length of time it took, where they were, that familiarity of that was my mother. Now this is my mother. What I don't understand what's going on. I'm a
mm.
child. I must be at fault. I must have done something wrong. All of that happens underneath the surface. Um, so it is those feelings are still there, even if people don't necessarily know. And it's really ironic because I remember meeting somebody not so long ago who was adopted and never thought it was an issue because they were adopted right at birth. And they had to deal with certain traumas in their lives. They kept having a repeating cycle in their lives. And when they discovered that repeating cycle, they went chasing their birth mother fairly shortly afterwards. They discovered their birth mother had been through that exact same cycle.
Mm.
That was the way she lived her life. It wasn't normal for that girl in the home in which she grew up in for that to be the case. So for some reason, even though literally she was literally taken at birth, she was continuing that same cycle,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, um, and that's the process that she has dealt with now. But with 8 to 8.5 billion, however many people are on the planet these days, um, everybody processes all this stuff differently. But ultimately, it comes down to that feeling of being loved and wanted.
It's uh it's a lot of stuff to
There's a lot there, and everybody is different within that process. So
mm,
as you're dealing with people, you're dealing with them differently. What you are doing though is you are giving them the resources to feel good enough and to let go of the negative emotion that they've been carrying around that stuff. Ultimately, that's what you're doing. It's an empowering process that allows people to really feel good enough in themselves. Because adopted people will often not feel good enough, so they push themselves. They'll just push themselves. They don't have to be adopted for that to happen, by the way. But they do push themselves. They do aim to achieve. They're always maybe overworking to achieve certain things to prove they're good enough. I'm no different, by the way. And it's really funny because I did adoption training with Sheila Granger, and she and I would have had that conversation all the time. And she's exactly the same, you know. Um, and she uses that as a superpower to achieve. She
Okay.
acknowledges that. Um, so it doesn't have to be a negative.
No. So in your life, this has impacted you too. What did you come to a state where you needed some help, and what did you do?
Um, yeah, I mean the process, it was a journey to be honest.
Okay.
It was a journey. I mean, growing up as a kid, I would have always felt I was kind of a shy kid. I think I've subsequently discovered where my voice is these days, but um, I would have been quite a shy kid and quite a shy teenager. And some of that was always aimed at kind of I wasn't feeling good enough. Now, it was compounded in my circumstance because my father died when I was 15 and my mother died then when I was 17. So by the
Okay.
time I was, you know, by the time I had turned 18, I'd lost the three most significant adults in my life. Uh,
Yeah.
I tend to describe it. So there was a lot of anger and there was a lot of frustration and there was a lot of compounded feeling. And that was in Ireland of the time where you just didn't talk about this stuff. You just got on with it. That was it, full stop.
Mm.
Um, but it would have manifest in behaviors. It would have manifest in overwork, and it would have manifest in firstly anger and pain for a long time. But going through that process, or maybe just accepting that process, um, it became about achieving. It became about proving it's good enough. Um, it really, I suppose, became an issue later in life because the feeling of rejection would have always been there. And I got separated around 2009, and it was a really difficult period for me. Um, and I think I went to about a year of psychotherapy. Um, and to be honest, even though the psychotherapist was a very lovely person, it almost became a codependency relationship, and I knew I had to stop it. So I just chose a different path, and I happened to choose a meditation, spiritual path for a while. And then when I discovered hypnotherapy, I began to really research myself into this. I used a lot of the tools that I learned on myself. And then with the connections and friends that I'd made en route, I got a lot of support through that.
Mm.
Um, and that really has been the journey. And now I've taken that and went, okay, what works for me, you know, from a principle basis. I'm not talking about one particular technique because there is no individual technique that does this. This is
No.
about understanding stuff at a conceptual level that allows you to deal with somebody in their own way, the way that they wish to be dealt with,
Mm.
the way that works for them, because everybody's different,
Yeah.
you know. So yes, that was a long answer to a question. Yes, I did receive therapy. It started as psychotherapy, it finished as hypnotherapy, and I would never go back to the psychotherapy route because when I understand it now, um, and I didn't necessarily at the time, the all of the stuff was stored in my emotional brain, and psychotherapy is a very painful way to go there,
Mm.
extremely painful way to go there, and it doesn't need to be that painful.
No. No.
It really doesn't.
No. Um, so if there is someone out here right now who has who is adopted and has this feeling of not feeling, the feeling of being, what did you say, rejected?
Rejected or not feeling good enough.
Not feeling good enough. What would you say to them?
Where's the evidence? And all I've done with that question is bring you into your logical mind. Where's the evidence? And when you go look for it, it's not there, which means to show you that it's emotional. And I would suggest that you literally talk to somebody and be open. Therapy is an amazing tool, but not psychotherapy for this. I'm sorry for any psychotherapist watching this. As somebody who's lived it, as somebody who understands it, it's emotional. I often tell a story, and I will tell a story here if you'll give me about a minute of your time.
Do that.
I tell a story to my clients, and I tell them to every client actually. But I live in the country, and I bought the house 3 years ago, and the house was empty for 2 years prior to that. So I'm surrounded by farms, and nature had taken full control of the house. There was all kinds of things running around the house when I moved in first. Anyway, pest control and a cat got all of that sorted. But about this time last year, I was sitting there one night, and there was this almighty noise under the floorboard. And I thought, oh my God, this is either the biggest fecker or 100 of the small ones. And I had a piece of wood nearby, and I banged the floor, and sure, about 10 seconds later, it started again. And I thought, wow, that's brave. So I just put out a trap, and I came down the following morning. There was a tiny mouse about that size, and nothing since. And I thought, it just really got me thinking. The space between the concrete and the wood where the mouse was is quite small. And that mouse was quite small.
Mm.
And when you have something that's small in a small space, it makes a lot of noise. But it was tiny in comparison to me. Our emotions are an awful lot like that. When they happened, we gave them a lot of significance at the ages that we did, but you're not that age anymore. So it's actually okay to go back and look at it and not be fearful of looking at it.
Yeah.
Because you're not 2, you're not 3, you're not 1, you're not 5. And this is valid in any therapy, by the way. Because the biggest fear that people have is looking at they feel the emotion, they feel they can't handle the emotion. But when you do it as an adult alongside that child through hypnotherapy, then it's not as painful. So don't be afraid to seek that help, basically, to talk to somebody about it and to recognize that you're fine.
Yeah. And the future can be so fantastic.
As you think about it from a fourth-dimensional perspective, everything is possible. Absolutely everything is possible.
Yeah.
So anything can happen, including the positives.
Okay. I don't think we should make it longer.
No.
Oh, I have one thing. That could be interesting, just to finish with this.
Yeah.
Because I have these cards. It's called Good Vibes, and on these there is a English.
You do not always have to understand others. It's all right to have different views of reality. Love them anyway. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. But yeah, and I think it's really, we talked about this topic, and I picked this card, and I think it's really, it says all about the things that you were talking about today. You don't always have to understand others. It is all right to have different views of reality, love them anyway, and that's also about your parents.
Yeah.
You don't always have to understand them, why they did what they did. Just love them anyway. It's something about, just give the feeling away, the hate,
Yeah, it's learning how to love them is the real key.
yeah.
And that's letting go of the emotion first. So it's letting go of the negative emotion that anyone might feel about an adoption, the anger, the hurt, the pain. People view emotion as painful. Um, but it's about releasing the anger first, the hurt. And I have a process that I use for people to verbalize what they need to say in their own mind. They don't actually physically have to say those words, but they
Mm.
do it with emotion, so they get the emotion out. Now, one process may not be enough. It may take more than one go to get rid of all that, and that's fine. And then it's about a re-engineering almost of their view of their life to date. So it's an inner child journey that begins before they've even entered the womb and reimagines that journey as the adult with them, reassuring them, surrounding them by a field of love, even in the womb, surround them by a field of love, um, and going through life all the way up to today.
Mm.
So that what they've done is they've started to build those, know that they've always been surrounded by a field of love, that they are actually okay. And that sometimes that journey takes more than once, and that's okay because people feel things differently.
Yeah. And they need more than one time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it takes a while to get to that inner child journey. It's not something you do in the first go, that's for sure.
No. But when you do it, it's really amazing.
And I know they're ready when they do it.
Yeah.
Very occasionally, I'll do it at the beginning so that they know, but it depends on the type of person, so that they know the hot spots that they have to go through.
Mm.
The ones that are really significant. But more often than not, it's reverse. We
Mm.
clear the hot spots in a content-free way or in a regression type way. But always with the adult with you, never child with child. It's adult with child.
Yeah. Always.
Always,
Yeah.
yeah.
I do the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm. So forgiveness is also something which
Yeah,
is
the
very
process I
important.
run is a thing called anger release forgiveness.
Mm.
Um, so you can replace the word anger with anything. It can be grief. Um, but ultimately, it's about explaining to the client that forgiveness is actually not even for the others, it's for you.
Yeah.
Because you're holding on to anger, pain, hurt, blame, whatever it is. It's like holding a hot coal ready to throw it at somebody. Who's getting hurt? Me, I'm holding it,
Mm.
you know?
Yeah.
It's about that perspective of you never have to even have a cup of coffee with them, but or if you're someone who's really monetarily orientated, you can say something like, that pain is just like living rent free in your body
Yeah.
because you're not using more productively. But
No.
enjoy in there, you know, whatever it is, or just don't have a negative thing inside. Because I work a lot with medical stuff as well, so I know the effect of holding on to this manifests in the body. So
Yeah, it can make you sick, physical sick.
it does, yeah, it does.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it does. Mm. Okay, John, this is
Thank you. It's
that
been a
was
lovely,
that.
lovely
Thank you for
conversation.
yeah, very. It's I enjoyed it.
All right.
Thank you
Have
for
an
sharing.
amazing day.
Have a great day.
Absolutely. You too.
Bye.
Bye.
So that was John Scanlon from Ireland. We had this talk, and I hope that this is something for you. Anyway, I have this stone from Ireland, and I bought it in Dublin some years ago. And I really like this don't worry stone. Why worry stone? And I'm going to read the letters on it. It says, Why worry? There are only two things to worry about. Either you are well or you're sick. If you are well, then there is nothing to worry about. But if you are sick, there are two things for you to worry about. Either you get well or you will die. If you get well, then there is nothing to worry about. If you die, then there are two things to worry about. Either you go up or down. If you go up, then there is nothing to worry about. But if you go down, you will be so busy shaking hands with old friends, you won't have time to worry anymore. See you in my next podcast, From Thoughts to Transformation. And until then, take care of yourself. Tune into this mini-series on adoption. In the upcoming episode, you will meet Annette, who was adopted from Hungary, and I will share my own personal story about finding a sister later in life. So stay tuned for more heartfelt stories about adoption, identity, and emotional healing.